Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Sergey Eagleman, and many of you already know him and have collaborated with him. Sergey is a postdoc at Berkeley in David Wagner's group. This is a Scrub group of researchers, professors, and collaboration with Intel and so on. And Sergey today is going to tell us about his recent work with his colleagues on the security, privacy, permission systems, and so on mobile devices.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks a lot for having me. Most of the talk today is about permissions. I say mobile devices, but honestly, I think a lot of this is applicable to a lot of other different types of platforms as well. So most of this was inspired by some work that several of my colleagues did looking at malware on mobile devices. And so they did this study about a year ago, a little over a year ago, and were analyzing malware found on mobile devices in the wild, and found that actually a majority of it is aimed at monetizing various information collected off devices. And so in terms of putting this into information that's useful for users, so they found that a lot of it is sending premium SMS messages, whereas most legitimate applications don't use the SMS permission. So if we wanted to give advice to users, we might say that the SMS capability signals potential malware. Therefore, if you see apps that request SMS ability, you should be wary. Don't use them. And so the question is, given the current way that most mobile platforms are designed, is it really possible for users to follow advice along these guidelines? So looking at potentially harmful permissions and screening apps based on that. So to give an example, so I'm going to show this with regard to Android. So we've done a lot of this research on Android, but again, I think a lot of this is applicable to a lot of other different platforms. So anyway, so we go to the Android market. Say we want to find a clock app. So we search for clocks. It brings up a whole bunch of different apps. We find that one that looks appealing based on the title or the price. We click it. Then brings up a description. Lots of other information here, more of a description, the title, the manufacturer, some screenshots. So if we like this one, we'll click download, and then it brings us to another screen. So on this screen, it gives the user the choice, first and foremost, to accept this and download. But then below that, it lists the permissions that the thing is requesting. And of course, with limited screen real estate, you can only really show 3 permissions at a time. So if the user wants to scroll down, they find all the way at the bottom that, yes, this wants to send SMS messages. So now they have to go back to the description page, go back again, go to the search results, and now we find another app. So we click this one, it brings up the description page again. We click download, and now we find that it doesn't have any offending permissions. So this took 10 steps just to figure out which apps are requesting SMS permissions or not. So maybe one possible improvement is by redesigning the architecture of the market. We could, if SMS is the most important one that users care about, we could add maybe a little icon to annotate. And so now this goes from 10 steps into 1 step. To give another example of this problem to emphasize this. So if we have an existing app and users just hear about this, that their app's sending premium SMS messages, maybe they have some fraudulent charges on their bill, they want to look at existing apps on their phone. So they go to the main screen, click the menu thing, it brings up a whole bunch of their apps. They have to scroll down, find the settings app, click that, and then it brings up a whole bunch of different settings panels. So they have to scroll down again, find the applications one, click that, click manage applications. Now it shows a bunch of applications on here. So maybe they look at the flashlight one. They want to look at that one first. So it brings up settings for the flashlight app. Now we have to scroll down just to see what permissions it's requesting. So the problem is, because the permissions are done at install time, the only time that the user is aware that it's sending SMS messages is when they click the install button. When it actually sends the SMS messages, they have no way of knowing. So now it takes a 12-step process in order to figure out post hoc which app was sending the SMS messages. So there must be a better way. And we've done some thought experiments on this. So one example, just off the top of my head, is maybe the first time an app sends an SMS message, you could have a pop-up box, and if the user doesn't click cancel in time, it sends the message and it shows where the message is going and what the text is, or maybe even just having a little icon that appears in the status bar. These are simple methods that would result in more awareness of what the phone's doing and how it's using permissions. So the talk for today is about this notion of choice architecture and how these design decisions can have profound impacts on security and privacy. And we're going to look a little bit at the problems with the current approaches, as well as some improvements we've come up with based on how to best use permission mechanisms in certain contexts for different types of permissions, as well as looking at what sort of permissions and risks users actually care about. So just to give a brief bit of background, this idea of choice architectures was popularized by Thaler and Sunstein in their book Nudge. It's a pop behavioral economics book. It's a quick, good read. But the idea here is all about framing. So when people are presented with options, how you frame those options can have profound effects on what options they ultimately choose. So soft paternalism. So to give an example, just looking at the different popular mobile platforms, they have varying numbers of permissions that users are confronted with. So on one end, you have Android, which has 165 different permissions. One thing I'll say right now is that this number, 165, fluctuates throughout the talk because we've done this on various different versions of Android. And so the number of permissions has gone from 120-some to 170, I think, in the most current version. So roughly 165 permissions now, 170, depending on which version of Android you're using. Windows Phone is sort of in the middle with 16 permissions, and iOS is on the other end of the spectrum with only 2 permissions that users are prompted with, location and pop-up dialogues. So the problem with having different numbers of permissions is on one end of the spectrum, if you prompt users with 165 different permissions, that's going to quickly result in habituation, and they're going to start ignoring everything because they see so many requests so frequently. On the other end of the spectrum, though, if you're not telling users what they're doing with their data, that's going to quickly result in outrage once it becomes public that a lot of this data is being collected potentially against their interests. So we've actually already seen this. There's been several stories in the news about apps on iPhone that have been collecting data that users were completely unaware about. So for instance, their contact list, there was the whole Path fiasco with the address books being uploaded. So there needs to be some amount of transparency, but too much can be counterproductive.
So for the iOS permission?
Yeah.
So any application can just directly access your camera without asking the user?
Correct. So there's a vetting process. I'm going to get into this in a bit. But there's a vetting process that apps are supposed to go through, and it's completely opaque. So who knows what Apple does to vet applications. There's a terms of service that says what you can and cannot do with data collected from the iPhone. So for instance, collecting address book data was completely against the terms of service. And an application that's being downloaded by millions of people, that should have been caught in the vetting process that it was doing this. The fact that it wasn't says something about the efficacy of the vetting process. So to look at some specific current problems, my colleagues and I did a study this past year where we were looking at Android permissions. And again, I think this is applicable to other platforms, some of the shortcomings here. So we did this in 2 parts. We first did an online survey. And the main thing was that we wanted to recruit existing Android users and make sure that they actually had an Android device. And we did this by using AdMob, which is a mobile advertising service. So we commissioned a bunch of AdMob ads that showed up on Android devices, and we basically had people take this survey on their device. We had a little over 300 respondents. So the first thing that we did was we had 3 different permissions. So we randomly drew these from a set of 9 or 10. And we had multiple choice questions where we showed the actual text of the permission. So in this case here, it's granting internet access. And we had these multiple choice questions asking users what ability this permission is requesting. And so, the answer here would be loading advertisements and sending your information to the application server. The other of these aren't really applicable. People who answered I don't know for these, we just filtered out. So there were 5 multiple choice answers which were not mutually exclusive. Well, none of these is mutually exclusive. Yes?
So can you go back to, so this list doesn't give me the best answer if I'm a technical person.
Why not? I mean,
because sending information to the application server is just one perspective. It should be this app can talk to any server on the internet.
Right. I mean, the question, though, is which of these does this permission allow? And so,
I'm just saying, like, it doesn't give me the best answer I can choose if I'm a technical person. I don't know if that will impact people's response. That's my question.
I'm not sure that was the case. I don't think that impacted any of the responses because most of the people didn't really have very strong technical backgrounds. Anyway, so we gave people 3 of these randomly drawn from a set of 9. And what we found was while the percentage correct was significantly higher than what the expected value would have been for random guessing at the 5 different responses, it was still very poor. So people got 0.6 questions out of 3 on average. So there were only 8 participants out of the 300 who were correctly able to define all 3 of the permissions. So we found that comprehension was very poor. So we decided to follow this up with a laboratory experiment to try and get some qualitative data to see why comprehension was so low. So we recruited 24 participants from Craigslist. Again, existing Android users. We had them come in with their existing Android devices, and we did the experiment on their Android device. So we had them install 2 different applications. We gave them scenarios where they were to find applications from the market, and we observed them to see whether they paid any attention to the permission screens during these installation processes. And then in the third part of the experiment, we asked them about an application that they use frequently on their phone, and we asked them what permissions it uses. And we had them go into the settings panel, like I showed you guys, so that they could actually see the permissions, and we had them describe those permissions to see, even when the permissions were in front of them, whether they were able to correctly define them. And then the last part, we asked them a specific question. So based on that list of permissions, we asked, can this particular app send SMS messages? And we found that the majority of them were incorrect. So a lot of the problem came from, this shows what they looked at during the installation processes. So the minority of them actually looked at permissions, and actually only about 40% were aware that permissions even existed. So in terms of the takeaways, we find that most of the problem comes from the fact that people don't actually look at the permissions because the screen comes too late in the process. Another explanation was that people were simply habituated. They said of the people who we didn't observe looking at the screen then and there, they said they are aware of permissions, but they don't look at them because they see these all the time. Many said that they actually thought it was a license agreement, and so clicking through was just a formality. And so we had some suggestions on how this could be improved. So one, only prompt on the permissions that are really important, that people actually care about, that have some likelihood of actual harm. And also the information needs to come earlier in the process. So when the permissions appear right now, it's after the user already clicks install. And so there are various cognitive biases that might prevent a user from going back in the process after they click install and deciding to find another application. Ben.
So I think there is something that's kind of left unsaid here. So we did studies along some of these lines ourselves, and I think what we find is that the way you talk about permissions is something negative, right? Something to minimize, something to reduce, something to contain, so on and so forth. Now, while what we find is that for many users, not all of them, but quite a large number, permissions is, the way they read that word, means capabilities. And
yes.
More capabilities means better. So the more permissions you have, the better off you are. And if you can get a free application that has the most permissions under the sun, like 154 in the case of Android, then you're golden, basically. You just won the lottery.
Yeah, I'm going to get to this in a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think, sort of that the negativity versus positivity sort of colors the interpretation of these results quite a bit.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And that's a result that we found later on. Stuart?
So you said this is too late in the process. Does that presuppose that what you're trying to do is make an install decision if you are allowed to deny the permission when it's requested?
Well, okay, so I'm going to later contradict what I just said, which is if we assume that we want to do this at installation time, and that's the assumption that I'm going to contradict later. If we assume that we want to do this at installation time, we shouldn't show it after the user clicks install. So there's maybe a choice supportive bias. So the user clicks install, then sees the permissions, and they might agree that these are bad and they don't feel comfortable granting these permissions, but at the same time, they don't want to second guess their previous choice or decide that they made a bad decision. So they're going to go ahead with it. And so that's one of the problems. If we agree that we're going to do this in installation time, we should have it earlier, which I'm not agreeing to.
Question. So look at the result. It seems like a lot of people just don't know what the permissions are.
Yes.
And I personally observed how my dad used Android phone, and just recently, that made me think, shall we actually even give user permissions? Shall we look at the problem from different angles to solve the problem from the app market as much as we can? Because there gotta be a significant fraction of users who have no idea of what permissions are.
Yeah, and I guess this is sort of a larger point, which I don't think I wasn't planning to get into during this talk. But what we found in this experiment was, this is in the paper, the vast majority of the users were making decisions based on app reviews rather than permissions. And the reviews were actually a pretty reasonable proxy for misbehavior of the apps. So people tended to trust reviews and felt that reviews were pretty accurate. And also, a lot of people who thought that permissions were maybe overreaching in many cases, that tended to be reflected in the reviews. And so, as a more general point, I think that the problem of malware on mobile markets is really non-existent, and instead the problem that we're trying to solve is grayware, apps that actually do offer a positive value proposition to most users, but are using data in secondary ways that might make some people uncomfortable. And so then it just becomes the objective is making these uses for the data a lot more transparent and give people choice. So. Anyway, so the second problem was comprehension. So of the small fraction of participants who did pay attention to these, and then also when we showed them permission screens and asked them to define these, we found that almost everyone was unable to define these permissions. When we explicitly asked, does this application that you use frequently send SMS messages, 64% were unable to say correctly whether it did or not. And one of the big problems we found was confusing the category with the actual permission. So here's a screenshot of one version of Android, and you see that it has these category labels which are in bigger, bold text right above the actual permission. So for instance, hardware controls is the category of recording audio. So asking people what this meant, they really only read the hardware controls part first and thought, well, maybe it has access to the camera, it can record audio, maybe it can vibrate the phone, turn the flashlight on. And so there was a lot of ambiguity here based on these category labels. The other problem that we found was given the extent of the extensive list of permissions, a lot of the permissions required understanding the full set to understand the actual scope of any one permission. So for instance, reading SMS or MMS messages, there are actually two different permissions for reading sent versus received messages. And unless you're aware that those two permissions exist, you're not entirely sure of what the scope is of this permission. So our suggestions from this was that these descriptions could be improved, possibly eliminating the categories, and also narrowing the list of possible permissions so that users don't have to understand 160, 170 different permissions in order to know what capabilities an app is trying to request. So in this previous study, we looked at the install time warnings, but what about other mechanisms? So for instance, on iPhone, and I think Windows Phone as well, there are some pop-up messages. So like for location, it'll ask if you want to grant location. So that's a different type of mechanism altogether. And of course, this is applicable to more than just smartphones in terms of mechanisms for granting permissions. So to recap, there are install time warnings. And these have been used extensively in Android because they're adaptable to many different permissions. The permissions are granted a priori before the user even opens the application. So the advantage here is that you can grant future abilities. You don't have to really do much from a platform developer standpoint. You just need to read in the manifest and then populate these fields in the installer. And some of the problems, though, with these is that there's limited real estate. So if you're prompting on all of these at install time, you can really only show 3 at a time here on this particular Android device. If there are more than 3 permissions, you're relying on the user to scroll down, and then there are questions of what order these permissions appear in. They're also easy to overlook, as I mentioned before. And the biggest problem, though, is that they lack context. Because they're granted a priori, the user doesn't understand in what situations these are actually going to be requested. So one improvement on this might be doing runtime warnings. So the advantage of runtime warnings is that you can add contextual information. So the user clicks a button and then they see this warning. Well, they knew what they were trying to do when the warning appeared, and therefore they have a little bit more contextual information that they could use to make a better decision. Another thing you could do is you could even put some of that contextual information in the warning. So here's a mock-up of maybe something pairing a device. You can show what the name of the device is. It's a lot more dynamic when you're doing it at runtime than ahead of time with the install time warning. But these have drawbacks as well. So habituation is a big problem. So if you're constantly showing warnings for everything, eventually users are just going to swat them away. Users often see these as a barrier to a primary task. So I probably don't have to go into the problems with UAC here. So another approach that Apple has been doing, in addition to their 2 different runtime warnings, they curate the market. So every app that's uploaded has to go through some sort of vetting process. But this should be a great idea because it keeps everything from the user. We're just telling them what's safe and what's not safe. User doesn't actually have to expend any sort of cognitive effort on deciding whether or not I should install this program. Of course, it's very resource intensive. So if you're hiring a team of people to manually vet apps, then this can get quite costly and it doesn't scale very well. The other problem is that it's completely opaque. Who knows what they're actually looking for? And so the example I mentioned before, so Path was uploading contact lists even though this was expressly against the terms of service. Well, because we have no idea what the actual process was, there was obviously some sort of flaw. And there have been several other emerging approaches, which I guess sort of fall into the category of trusted UI. Ben.
One thing that Apple does that's interesting is that they also do curating for, I don't know what these things are called, harsh language and kind of questionable content kind of thing, like movie
Right.
kind of rated R type of stuff. And presumably that's actually important to some category of their users.
Sure, but it's also a huge source of frustration for developers because in their terms of service it's offensive. Well, what's offensive? It's a completely subjective process.
And the other thing is that it also kind of, so developers I'm sure must be frustrated. I was looking at the book reader application on iOS recently. And basically, it has all of these warnings you can imagine because you can download books that would have harsh language and all of these other characteristics and such. The book reader obviously is to blame for that. So it is rather silly.
So there have been several papers on trusted UI. Most recently, work that Helen did on the access control gadgets at Oakland this year. And so the idea behind trusted UI is that you integrate the permission granting mechanism within the user's workflow. So buttons that are drawn by the OS. So the application developer specifies a placeholder. The OS draws the button, so nothing can be drawn on top of that. And it's a trusted path to granting this permission. It's part of the user's workflow, so they're not taking extra steps. This isn't an impediment to the primary task. And they can't be spoofed. I mean, they can be spoofed, but there's absolutely no incentive to spoof these because you're not going to grant the permission by spoofing them. So here's a mock-up of maybe we have one for sending SMS messages, and so maybe the OS draws the destination number on the button, and now it's just up to the user to click this button, and it sends the SMS message. Another advantage of trusted UI is then you can have more complex gadgets and use them, like choosers to choose subsets of the data. So maybe you have a calendar thing that wants to add a bunch of things to your system calendar. When you get, a prompt, then the user can go in and, do some finer-grained editing on what they approve and what they don't approve. Of course, trusted UI that's not really a panacea either, because they can't really be granted, you can't grant abilities in the future easily. And they also can't really handle asynchronous requests, so things that the user didn't initiate. That's a big difficulty. So you can't use trusted UI for everything. But I guess, so...
What does it mean by cannot be granted easily in the future?
I mean, I'm sure you could design, several, maybe objects in the OS to, with callbacks, where you're looking for specific events, from sensors when you're going to trigger the permission. So maybe you have a button that the user grants. But that sort of defeats the spirit of the trusted UI. It's no longer part of the user's workflow now.
Yeah, so we have this thing called scheduled.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. But it's no longer really part of the user's workflow. It's now a separate task that they're doing to schedule this permission request, and that sort of goes against the spirit.
No, I think it's exactly following the spirit, because it's the user who schedules it. And no one else can schedule it. For the things,
Sure.
in the scenario where it's not the user who schedules it, for the scenario where the schedule is not very clear for the user, or the program needs to use a permanent access, that's the scenario that there's no way for the user to communicate that to the system in the least privileged way.
I don't know. I think there's a much larger discussion there.
Okay.
Okay, well, we'll take that offline. And so there's several different mechanisms that you could use to grant permissions. But I think one of the big shortcomings that we see why there are problems in a lot of systems is that everyone just chooses one mechanism. There can be only one mechanism that we use for every permission. So in Android, all of it is done through install time permissions, and install time certainly has cases where it's effective, but
Windows
my next,
actually is trying to do both.
yeah,
Windows 8 too.
oh, that's weird. Just the preview for the next slide was really screwed up. So anyway, we did this thought experiment where we were looking at all of the permissions that are available on all the mobile platforms, and we combined them together by also merging redundancies and getting rid of stuff that the users don't really have any business being confronted with. So, like for instance, multicast or turning on debugging. Users probably don't care about those sort of things. So we came up with 83 unique permissions, and we did this thought experiment where we just sat down over the course of several weeks, going through each of these permissions and deciding what would be the most effective mechanism for granting this permission and why. So to give an example, maybe you have a security app that will permanently disable the device. If you report your device stolen, you go to some website, and then it fries your device. So one of the things we looked at is risk level. So this is pretty severe. You wouldn't want a random application bricking your device without your consent. Is this revertible? No, that's the whole point, is that it can't be undone. Is there incentive for widespread abuse? Probably. And so the consensus is the only real way of doing this, given the mechanisms available, would be at install time. So you're not going to have a trusted UI element on the device to brick it in real time because you don't possess the device. You're not going to have a runtime warning asking the person who's stolen your device whether they really want to erase the device or not. So another example on the other end of the spectrum. Yeah?
What would be incentive for widespread abuse? Why would someone want to do that? What's the
Malice.
blackmail?
Yeah, blackmail. Changing the time as the other end of the spectrum. So risk level. Really just an annoyance. Can you undo it? Yeah, absolutely. You can go back and change the time. Is there incentive for widespread abuse? I mean, maybe you can think of some, James Bond-esque nefarious plot where you update the time on everyone's cell phones as part of some, heist. But, realistically, you're not going to be spreading. It's unlikely you're going to see a lot of malware that the main attack vector is changing the time on people's phones. So the consensus here is that this is so minor and revertible that maybe we should just grant this implicitly whenever a device wants to change the time. But maybe we can have some audit mechanisms so the users can see what application changed the time. And so then this came up, we came up with this idea of the implicit access permission mechanism. So for things that are very minor and are either revertible or just pose an annoyance, we want to minimize habituation, so there's no point asking about these before they're granted. Instead, why don't we just let them go and make it easy for users to figure out what app is doing this? So in the case of changing the time, then maybe we have an audit mechanism by annotating the settings page, indicating which app most recently changed the time. And you could see this maybe for wallpaper as well, showing which app changed the wallpaper last. And so users can see if there's an offending app that's doing things against their wishes, they can then identify the app and remove it. And of course, though, this isn't to say that this permission shouldn't exist anymore for wallpaper or time. I could still imagine this being declared in a manifest file so that people then could audit what applications are actually doing. It's just that we're not confronting the user with these decisions. So from this, we came up with this sort of hierarchy of permission granting mechanisms from least desirable to most desirable. So in the absolute best case, we would hope that we're not going to confront users with things. We're just going to make it so it's easy to undo bad things that happen. And at the other end of this spectrum, there's if there's really nothing else we can do, we're sort of forced to use an install time warning and just sort of hope for the best.
So the trusted UI actually. So in the previous scenario when I talk about changing time and stuff,
yeah,
the trusted UI does not need to kind of disturb the workflow of the user at all, right? So, I mean, I guess, so here the trade-off.
So you have a couple permissions that need to go into effect at once. So in trusted UI, you'd have a series of button presses.
Just like the calendar picking you talked about. You just, is the system UI to change the application has to use the system, trusted UI to change
Sure,
the
but if you're going to have, sort of compound permissions,
no, it's not compound, it's very fine-grained. It's least privilege. It's completely capability.
No, I understand, but if you want a couple things to happen all at once, so,
So we have this notion of, what is that called?
Composition.
Composition.
Okay.
Right? Yep. So I think that, but I do see there's one benefit.
The user understands conceptually. They may not need to know that the time zone needs to change for something. Right?
Well, this is not, user does not need to do anything. User just need to, the application just uses system UI to change the time rather than directly invoking the API. So then I think there is a benefit to our approach, nevertheless. I think the benefit is not to disturb the user, but the benefit is to reduce the application development cost.
Sure. Yeah, I still disagree that in practice, I think that there are a lot of cases for where trusted UI is just going to annoy the user and disturb the flow.
The key of the trusted UI is not to.
Well, so some of the things.
It's not to be different. It's the application you already need to ask the camera. You already need to ask the user to click on the camera. The application already needs to.
Sure. Okay. So say changing the wallpaper. So you have an app that maybe does themes on the phone. So it's going to change the wallpaper, the skins.
The system UI to trusted UI in that case.
Sure, but then it's not.
It's just exactly like file picking. That's already being implemented in IE.
So I'm going to check offline, guys.
Yeah. Take this offline. So anyway, we came up with this flow chart for how to choose permissions. Yeah.
Unrelated to the discussion about trusted UI, I think there are two mechanisms missing here at least. One of which is user-initiated configuration of the permissions. Another of which is like an admin push permissions, where you might be getting an enterprise app from your enterprise administrator who is setting some appropriate default permissions for you.
I think the latter is out of scope because that doesn't involve the user, or the end user, really. I guess the point of this, I mean, in that case, that you could sort of lump that in with implicit access, right? Because it's stuff that's going on without user involvement at all. End user involvement. So we're going to be presenting this at HotSec in 2 weeks. We came up with this flow chart then for how to decide when to use which permission mechanism. So to give an example here, so granting internet access. So can this be undone? Well, not really. You can't get the bits back. Is it severe? If it's abused, is it going to cause, is it just an annoyance? Well, probably. I mean, if you're not roaming internationally, and you have an app that's using a lot of data, there's only so much that could happen. So we want implicit access here with an audit mechanism. So if we do find that we're over our bill 1 month, we can then look and figure out what application is hogging all of our bandwidth. So say we're roaming, though. So now this changes the severity. Did the user initiate it? Well, in many cases, no. The request to transmit data isn't really part of the user's flow. Can this be altered? Do you want to, it's unlikely. Yes, it could be altered. You could have some sort of firewall that the user is configuring, but that's unlikely in most cases. And so does this need to be granted ahead of time? Well, not really. So this would be a case for a confirmation dialog, maybe a runtime warning, when the application wants to request data when the user's roaming internationally. So the other example is a permanently disabling device.
Yes, I was wondering, when you're talking about severity of a permission, it seems like considering one permission at a time is not the right way to do, right? Because, say, internet access, right? By itself, it's not that bad. I mean, what else can go bad there? But if you have access to camera and internet access, well, things can go bad, right?
Yeah, this is a larger question. I think so. Many people bring this up with internet access, but actually, so we've been crawling the several application markets and looking at what permissions applications are requesting, and 90% of apps request internet access, and from the user's perspective, it's sort of expected that applications are accessing the internet. So, and that sort of is figured in, when we ask users about what are the risks of using the camera, it's sort of implicit that one of the risks is uploading that what's taken from the camera. So permanently disable. So you can't undo this. It's very severe. Not really initiated with the user who's holding the device. Can it be, can you do a subset of data? Well, not for this purpose if you want to brick the phone. And does this have to be done ahead of time? Yes. So the only time you're going to be able to do this easily is with an install time warning. So we looked at of these 83 permissions that we started with and how many of these could be lumped into each category. And so we found that actually a majority of them could be just granted without approval ahead of time, and then add some audit mechanisms. And so this has the potential to greatly reduce the number of user interactions, therefore preventing habituation. So about a quarter of these could be done with trusted UI. And
There's a question of whether how many of those implicit access can also be done by trusted UI. That would be a very interesting question.
Yeah, and I agree that I think a lot of the implicit access could be done with trusted UI.
All what you talk about actually can be done by trusted UI without prompting the user, without user knowing anything. We can talk more.
Yeah, OK. So one caveat with this is just categorizing the set of permissions. So this doesn't say anything in terms of how frequently users are going to be interacting with one of these. And this is actually a future thing, some joint work, which I'm going to get to in a little bit, that I'm doing with Jaehyun. One thing we're piggybacking on this is hooking. We're doing planning to do a field study. And as a secondary thing, we're hooking the API calls so that we can actually measure the frequency with which each of these permissions are actually granted typically. Well, not granted, but used typically.
Have you talked with the Android people in Google?
Yeah, so my co-author on this, Adrian is.
What?
Adrian is.
I see. Yeah, because I mean, that Android permission model is just so broken.
Yes. And actually, it's funny, Google hasn't been very receptive to this. We've actually gotten a lot more, the Mozilla people have been listening to a lot of this, more so than the Google people. I don't know, I guess you guys must be familiar with Boot to Gecko. So they're creating a whole new mobile platform based on the Gecko browser. And so,
They're new.
yeah.
There's no backward compatibility.
Right, yeah. So then this comes to the last question, which is, which permissions are actually important to users? So we've done a series of studies on this. So in one, which I presented recently at Weiss, we looked at, we did a willingness to pay study to try and get at what permissions are important. We did this on Mechanical Turk. We showed different screenshots of fictitious apps along with the permissions that those apps requested and prices. And the idea was to look at, we counterbalanced for the different apps, for the different fictitious apps, so that we can control for price and permissions requested. We had almost 500 people, a third of which were Android users, US-based. And so what we did was we had 4 conditions. The first condition was, the cheapest. We asked people which of these apps would they purchase if they had to purchase one of them. So for about 50 cents, 49 cents was the app that requested the most permissions. So internet access, GPS, and recording audio. So we chose these 3 permissions because, well, one, for the app that we described, internet access would be required, and also internet access, as I said, is requested in practice by almost every app anyway. And then we looked at record audio and location. We looked at location because it's been the subject of most of the mobile privacy research for the past 10, 15 years. So we figured this would be a good starting point to look at how do people actually care about location relative to other permissions. And then we looked at record audio because we asked about a couple permissions during our initial lab study that I talked about, and we found that recording audio against a user's wishes is one of the most severe ones people stated. So we decided to contrast that with location. So the next cheapest one was 99 cents. It was only internet access and the audio. Then $1.49, location and internet access. And then finally, for the fewest permissions, it was $1.99. So the task looked like this. Again, these are fictitious apps. They look different, so the names are different. The manufacturers are different. The prices, the descriptions and the screenshots are all different, but we counterbalance these. So, and so what we really did was control for just the price and the permissions. And so we found that 25% of our participants stated a willingness to pay more money for fewer permissions. To, I guess, get to Ben's point, so it's surprising here that people were paying, $1.49. We were surprised at the number of people who were in the middle 2 conditions, and the reason was in the exit survey, they thought that some of these additional permissions signaled desirable features. So if it requested location, that's good. They want to pay extra for the location. And we found that this effect carried for about half of our participants. So the request for location was just as likely to signal desirable features as an undesirable encroachment on personal privacy.
Users actually have to pay somehow?
No.
Or is this just expressed a willingness?
Yes, it was just, it was stated willingness to pay. Oriana.
This correlate to the interest of the user in this app? Because if the user is not
We
interested,
measured that actually. So after we asked them to pick an app, we asked, how interested are you in this app? Because we were originally thinking that if there was going to be a correlation between, their willingness to pay and also desirability, we were going to, toss out the people who were just uninterested. But we found that there was actually no significant correlation whatsoever. So we ended up using all of our participants. But again, this was, stated willingness, so this is probably an upper bound. But it's still interesting that a statistically significant proportion of our users were willing to pay, 3 times as much more for, 4 times as much to get fewer permissions.
How many fewer? How many? Can you give some more details?
Yeah, so there was the difference between the first condition and the last condition.
Okay. So the internet access, GPS, was the third one?
Recording audio. And so from this, in our exit survey, we also asked about several other permissions. We had, I think, 15 permissions that we asked people about, and we had them rank them in terms of concerns. And so we ordered those on the right, and we had also done this in our initial survey that we did on AdMob, and we found some differences based on these rankings. And this came down to, there are several confounding factors here. So one is we used different recruiting mechanisms. One was AdMob, one was Mechanical Turk. We did this over different time periods, but also we didn't use exactly the same permissions that we were asking about in both cases. One thing, though, that was interesting was that of the permissions we asked about, location was consistently towards the bottom. But based on the discrepancies and the confounding factors here, we decided we should do another survey just looking at concerns over permissions, of all the permissions that we could find. So we took all of the Android permissions. At that time, I guess it was around 170. We used the 16 Windows Phone permissions. We were going to incorporate iOS as well, but we had already covered that set based on these. And then we merged redundancies and got rid of extraneous ones, and we were left with 54 total permissions. So we did this card sorting exercise on a whiteboard. So to give an example of redundant ones, there were 2 different permissions for reading received versus sent SMS messages. That doesn't really need to be 2 permissions. What's the difference between power off and reboot? Not that much. The difference between force stopping applications and killing processes, and so on. So we decided we could merge these into single permissions. Ben.
So, given all of these, how did this really wide set of permissions in Android come about? It seems like somebody was just sort of randomly inventing these things and writing down whatever came to their.
I've heard different stories. The story that I've heard most consistently was that it was forced upon the developers by the legal team.
In this really kind of.
I don't know about the number of the permissions, but in terms of doing it the way that they do, where they show everything, ahead of time. I mean, it's no wonder why many users said this looked like a license agreement. It's because the initial version of Android was the lawyers decided this is how we're going to do this. I don't know how they came up with 170 some, or they decided what would be a permission and what wouldn't. I can't really answer that. But so another example would be getting rid of extraneous ones. So enabling multicast, for instance, how many users are going to be qualified to answer that question. So we got rid of that. And so we did this survey, again on Mechanical Turk. We had over 3,000 participants. From these 54 different permissions, we wrote down possible negative outcomes. And we came up with 99 possible outcomes that corresponded to these permissions. And so from these 99, for each participant, we randomly chose 12 of them that we showed to each person, and we had them rank these. And the idea was we weren't interested in sort of baseline level of concern. That's impossible to determine without really, context, and also you can't really determine that without these actually happening to most users. But we wanted to try and rate these relative to each other so we could figure out what are the most concerning permissions and what are the least concerning. So we had a 5-point Likert scale, and we worded this as, how would you feel if an app ... without asking you first? And so we showed 12 of these concerns. We had people rate them. And what we found was that for the high concern risks, most of this came down to financial loss. So sending premium SMS messages, which is how most malware monetizes itself, making expensive calls, long distance or international 1-900 numbers, destroying the device or destroying data, such as doing a factory reset, deleting contacts. Incidentally, I was just talking with Helen about this. A lot of these big concerns, like the data loss, could be potentially you could revert to a previous state if we had really well integrated cloud backup and recovery. So you might not, in the future, you might not need permissions about, surrounding these if we would make it really easy to get your data back.
So there's another question there.
Yeah.
How about the other damages? There's the recovery maybe in these scenarios are easily done. Are there may be other damages associated, all your contacts are being sent to other people.
Yeah, so we were surprised that we found sort of in the middle of the list was sort of the privacy stuff, like information disclosure. And the reason why that was in the middle of the list is that was very high variance. So it was like 25% of the permissions were at the top were universally concerning, so stuff with financial loss and data loss. At the bottom, the low concern stuff, so changing settings, which could easily be undone. Sending stuff to other computers only. So for instance, sending your location just to an application's servers to find location-based services and no human sees it. People really did not care about that at all. And sending other data like that, so like unique identifiers. As long as no human sees the resulting data, people don't really care about that. Then there's sort of the middle 50%. And it wasn't that people just ranked these in the middle. It was that these are very polarizing and high variant. And so I think a lot of more work needs to be done, maybe clustering these, maybe coming up with personas to look at, developing better algorithms to decide of the ones in the middle what users are likely to care about these and which users are not. But again, so one of the points I made earlier is that, and this was echoed here, is that location, people really don't care about this. I misstated that. It's not that they don't care about it. They care about it less than many other things that their devices could potentially be doing. So mobile privacy has been studied for at least 15 years now, but location has been the sole focus of that. But compared to all these other things that could have profound privacy consequences, people care about location a lot less. So we asked about location sharing in 4 different contexts. So sharing location with members of the public was the most concerning, but it still ranked 52 out of 99 concerns. Sharing with advertisers, friends, and then at the bottom, app servers. So as long as no human was seeing it, people didn't care at all about location. And so then this brings me to the last point, which is looking at context and how context impacts a lot of these decisions. So given 2 different requests, so maybe Twitter wants your phone number, and this is how a request might currently appear, where there's no other information. It's just saying this application wants this type of data, allow, don't allow. But maybe we're going to add some context. So if we say that it's for advertising purposes, obviously this is going to have a huge impact on whether users allow this request or not. So this is work that I'm currently doing with Jaeun, where we're looking at the impact. If we add a rationale for the request, what are the impacts on users? So the initial idea was basically to add a UI to taint droid so that we can say, if we know that this is going to known advertisers, why don't we put that in these warnings so that they're more contextual? And there are a lot of variables. Now, this is work in progress, so I don't really have that much data on this. But some of the things that we're looking at are differences between if we say that it's going to first party versus third party. Is that going to make a difference? If it's only viewable on the device versus leaving the device, does that make a difference? And actually, to the latter question, we can say no. We've already looked at that. And so we did an initial pilot. We did this on Mechanical Turk with 100 users, and we had them view a screenshot of a request. We said, you're using Facebook, for instance. We did this for 4 different apps. And you see this screen. What would you do and why? So in the control condition, we had Facebook requesting the address book with no other information. We then specified that the purpose is application features, and data will leave the device. Another condition was application features and data will not leave the device. Advertising, data will leave the device. And analytics, data analysis, data will leave the device. And so from this preliminary pilot, one, we found that people had no idea what was meant by analytics, and so we probably shouldn't specify that, or just maybe group it into advertisers or either first party, third party. There was no distinction between data remaining on the device or going to the cloud. So the difference between application features that were going to be processed in the cloud versus on the device, people didn't care. But across all these conditions, despite specifying a rationale in a word or two, 60% of our participants, regardless of conditions, still wanted more detail. So we did a follow-up. We had 5 different conditions here. Similar to before, we had a control where we didn't specify any other information. We had what we called the app functionality condition, which is shown in the picture here. So we specified both a purpose, which was application features and customization, as well as a sharing policy. So data will not be shared with third parties. We had an add condition where for the purpose it said advertising. Yeah.
Who specifies this purpose? Is it like the app developer will specify this purpose and this sharing? Because it seems like there's really no way to enforce these things, right?
Well, there's certainly policy ways of enforcing it. I mean, privacy policies are enforceable.
Right, but like, who will enforce that? Is it the mobile OS?
Well, I mean, if people are lying in these, that's FTC enforceable.
You're talking about legal
policy.
Okay.
I mean, so this is sort of a thought experiment, right? So we're not, forgetting the limitations of the technology, if we were going to engineer it this way, if we found this is effective, then the question would be, what are the steps that we would need to do to make this possible? So we had advertisements where we said the purpose was advertising and this would be shared with third parties. And then we got rid of the purpose box altogether and just specified sharing between first party or third parties. And we also had 4 within subject conditions where we just varied the application and the type of data. So we showed Facebook requesting the address book. And we had Yelp looking for location, Skype asking for their phone number, and a My Calendar app wanting access to the calendar. We chose these apps because they were the most popular apps on Google Play that requested these permissions. And so the preliminary findings are that when no information was given, this was really surprising. In the control condition, people assumed that data would not be shared. So there was not a statistically significant difference between the control condition and the conditions that said data would not be shared with third parties, which was surprising because we're cynical and thought that, I tend to think anyway that when no information is given about sharing policy, it can be assumed it's going to everyone. This wasn't the case for most users. So we also found that there wasn't really a difference between whether or not we showed the purpose. It really came down to who it was being shared with and why. People asked afterwards in the exit survey that regardless of the condition that they were in, everyone wanted to know more information about why the data was being shared and with whom it was being shared. If it wasn't being shared, they cared a lot less. So our next steps with this is we're planning a lab study. And so this is sort of a new mock-up that we've been doing. So people want about half of our participants wanted this information about who data is being shared with. So the idea is now maybe we want something expandable. So at the high level, gives you a brief synopsis, and for users who want more information, they could maybe click, if it is shared with other companies, they can click that, something expands, stating the name of the company, contact information, why that company is requesting the data, what that company does. These are all the things that people wanted. So we wanted to look in the laboratory whether people will expand these and be more able to answer questions about what's happening with their information. And so this is an iterative design process, and once we've honed the designs, we're planning to do a field study where we're going to instrument people's phones with these with these warnings and look at how they interact with them, and also at what point habituation takes effect. So at some point, people are probably going to swat these away without paying much more attention. Another thing we're looking at is scoping. So clicking the box for remember this decision, under what circumstances would people want to select that? So will they want to revisit the decision if a sharing policy changes, if the purpose changes? Do they want this decision to remember it to hold for this one application for all types of permissions, a specific subset of permissions? So these are the questions we're looking at now.
I have a question. There's a corner case, like in a Yelp case, the location is used both for the main purpose, like the funny restaurants, and also share with the ad network.
Yes.
And then it's kind of hard to automatically tag that one first. The second is it's also hard to figure out which one is primary, which one is secondary. So what's your take on that?
I mean, this needs to be put into the warning that I don't think primary purpose that's probably not the best wording, but purpose, and so it might say both, right? Application-specific features and advertising, and that's why we're doing these iterative, design experiments to try and figure out, what's the best wording to communicate that.
We're currently doing sort of stack introspection to see which component of the code is asking location access. So as long as location is accessed by third-party component within the code, we know which component is doing it. So that way we can differentiate. But there's a question of if this first-party component access requesting the location, and that's also shared with other parties, that then makes this warning a little complicated.
Yeah.
Why don't you throw in some random explanations into the mix, like to avert global warming or to save puppies?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I think that will they'll do whatever, to save the puppy.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is...
That's a good control condition.
No, I mean, yes, and there's a famous behavioral economics study on this, where people, if you give any explanation, people generally comply with requests, regardless of how ridiculous the explanation is. But the point is, actually going back to a previous question, the idea is that the text that we put there is standardized. So one thing I want to test in the near future is iOS 6 is planning to have developer-specified text next to the warnings, so why location is being requested. And my hypothesis is that if developers are specifying this and there's no standard text that's used, it's going to quickly lose all meaning to most users. And so the platform developer needs to specify what's the appropriate text that'll appear here. And so under that constraint, I don't think anything like preventing global warming or saving puppies, most platform developers would allow to be on their set of permissible texts. So the conclusion is that a lot of the current choice architectures for mobile privacy and security are failing users because the requests are going unnoticed. There are way too many of them, and they're difficult to understand. But at the same time, users really do express an interest, anyway, in knowing what the apps are doing. And there's a lot that we can do in helping to design the platforms to accommodate that. So that's it. Thanks.
So, I mean, a lot of the emphasis is on kind of trying to figure out, asking people at the time of install what permissions they're going to grant. I mean, have you looked at it all? Do people have any understanding of, of the 10 or 20 apps that I've got on this? Do you understand how many of these have any of the permissions you're now, making such a big deal about, right? Oh yeah, I don't want to share permission for ad purposes. Do you have any idea of the 20 that you've already got?
No, I mean, the answer is no. So, I mean, in the first study that I talked about, when we had people, we had them open an application that they've used frequently and they claim to be familiar with. And while looking at the permission screen, we ask, can this send SMS messages? And 64% couldn't answer that question when looking at the list of permissions that the app was requesting, as well as based on their knowledge of the app having used it. So.
No, I don't want to allow my location for advertising. Well, you've already done it with 20 others. Like, why is it such a...
Sure. Well, and I think that, again, advertising that's a little bit more nuanced, but I think generally speaking, if a lot of the data uses was made more transparent to users, so, maybe with notification icons, so when location is being requested, having a more so when the GPS icon appears, if a user wants to, they could click on it maybe, and it'll show what application's using the GPS, and maybe some, short explanation of why. It's likely that a lot of people will, I believe that many people, might actually interact with that to make some effort. But right now, the mechanisms just don't exist for the people who are interested in learning more.
Right now what you're doing is you're measuring basically the delta in my privacy posture. Like right now, I have absolutely no idea what my privacy posture is, and you're measuring how big a deal is it to have a delta. Like I go from no idea to no idea, right? And it's.
Well, I mean, so we know that people express concern, and we know that they're not currently being served, and so if we can, incrementally show that we're getting closer to aligning with their stated preferences. I mean, and certainly we know that stated preferences are kind of bogus to begin with, but there's some grain of truth to when people express desire for keeping certain data private.
So if you look at installation time permissions, which is great and sort of a typical focus. What about sort of the other side of the story, which is what about people who delete their applications? What about questioning them and asking why?
We've actually done that.
Okay.
I don't have the data off the top of my head. Adrian just ran a survey. I haven't looked at the results yet. So we designed a survey, a very qualitative survey, where we're asking them if they've uninstalled applications before and why they've uninstalled those applications. But I don't have the data off the top of my head. I can send it to you once I have it.
That would be very tough.
Is that sent to some conference or?
I'm not sure if we've so we started
Evaluating why the user deletes
Yeah.
an application.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've submitted that anywhere yet. I haven't seen the results, so I would hope that she didn't submit it anywhere. But yeah.
Any last questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.